What's interesting about the net neutrality debate is that it, to date, has been largely about a hypothetical harm versus a hypothetical business model. That is to say, if you go to the net neutrality proponents and you say, what's happening in the market today that you don't like, other than the Comcast thing, there really isn't any kind of activity that it's what they might do in the future. But if you go to the network providers and you say, well, you say you're providing non-discriminatory access today, why would you object to a rule that requires that? They go, well, but in the future we might want to prioritize, et cetera. So there's always the possibility of some actual action changing that debate. But as we look, going back to your question about what happens, the debate is fundamentally, neither side can win right now. The election may change that.
How so?
Pardon?
How so?
Well, if the Democrats win, I mean, the two Democratic presidential candidates have said we want network neutrality. I think they have different meanings to it, but I'm not sure it's that fully developed. So presumably an FCC chair appointed by one of those two folks would go in and say, somehow we're going to get network neutrality, whereas I don't think McCain has come out in favor of it. And so that is a very clear partisan divide. But having said that, there are some other things that will affect it too. If we wake up sometime this week and discover that Google actually bought the so-called C block, which, by the way, they didn't, or at least I'm guessing they didn't. But if I'm wrong and they actually bought it, the pressure for net neutrality starts to really diminish. If you have a new entrant, it starts to diminish. If Sprint actually builds out its 2.5 network and starts getting a lot of customers with a real open platform, the pressure for regulatory intervention diminishes. On the other hand, if Sprint collapses and it's having a significant amount of problems, if it turns out that the winners of the auction, as we suspect, were almost all, that $20 billion is basically being spent by incumbents to strengthen their own networks, then you have a different kind of political calculus coming up with looking at toward February of 2009. So the debate gets real again in some sense in 2009.
As you said, there are multiple definitions of this and get very thorny. Let me try and put it as simply as possible. If what we want, if what we're considering is what's the best way to price internet access to the consumer, wireless or broadband, there are basically three choices. You overbuild a network, or rather you offer people unlimited flat rate pricing, which is what we've grown used to on broadband. But that requires in turn that the network provider has overbuilt the network, which is a massive, massive investment that has been made, which has been made on the broadband side and has not been made yet on the wireless side. It's simply not feasible to ask the wireless carriers today to offer us all unlimited data plans for one flat rate. So you've two choices. You could have tiered pricing, where I'm going to pay this rate for 1 megabit per second, this rate for 2 megabit per second, or perhaps I pay this rate for this amount and then I pay an overage charge for data over that, which is the model that we're all familiar with from the way they price for voice. Or you can have this complex network management regime where a bit for a text message is priced differently for a bit that's online video or a bit that's web browsing, and some services are allowed and some services are not allowed at all. And even if you take the time to study all of the policies, oh, and by the way, the network providers don't actually disclose what their policies are. They don't tell you in advance what they do and do not block. And if you do read it all, you still have the problem that you sign up for a 2-year contract and some other service comes to market, some new service is launched that they subsequently decide to block. You're out of luck until the end of your contract. I find that as a consumer unacceptable for a whole range of issues. It's just grossly inconvenient. It requires me to pay too much close attention to terms and conditions and to fine print, and it could leave me with a nasty surprise after I make one purchase and then discover that the primary reason that I bought the service no longer applies. So given those two choices, as a consumer, I'd go for tiered pricing any day of the week. I give me 2 megabits per second, give me 5 megabits per second, give me 8 megabits per second, whatever you can afford to give me, but let me download anything I like at that rate and for that price. And that still gives the network provider every incentive they need in order to generate the profits necessary to reinvest back in the network. And by the way, where we ultimately get to in that course is that everybody overbuilds their network and starts moving towards flat rate pricing.